So-called Millionaire's tax is facing new questions after emails obtained by the Center Square suggest some lawmakers anticipated a legal challenge that could reach the state Supreme Court. The emails obtained through a public records request also show communication with the Attorney General's office during the bill's drafting.
So a report just dropped that recently exposed something that we've talked about on this channel and I speculated about multiple different times, which is the so-called Millionaire's tax, which, by the way, was passed by the Washington state legislature and will come into effect in 2029 pending legal challenges, is actually an end around the constitutional amendment prohibiting an income tax because the Democrats in the state of Washington want to tax absolutely everyone. And while, of course, this was my speculation, it was obviously based in the reality of what we see time and time again whenever we're promised a tax that's only going to be a small amount on a small group of people. Eventually, once they get the precedent, it applies to everyone. But a recent Freedom of Information Act request resulted in the receipt of over 1,000 documents that shows that the Democrats in the state legislature were actually working with the Attorney General in order to craft this tax specifically so that they can implement a tax on absolutely everyone and overturn a 1933 Washington Supreme Court decision that prohibits differentiation in tax rates so that they can have that progressive tax and apply it to absolutely everyone. And by the way, this is done to absolutely not have to deal with the constitutional issue in Washington state, and admittedly so in this documentation. And this is what we're going to talk about today. It is not surprising at all whatsoever, but before we get into that, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
The Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter TJ Martinell talking about a recent breaking story of his involving hundreds of pages of records from the state attorney general's office discussing with the Senate Majority Leader how to potentially overturn a state Supreme Court ruling recognizing income as property as a way to push a graduated progressive income tax potentially onto residents like you and I.
So look, while this reporter did an absolutely wonderful job getting that information out to the public, obviously it's a little bit too little too late because this legislation did pass both the state house and the state senate and was signed by the current governor of Washington state. The fact is, it's good to see it in black and white that the attorney general is conspiring with the Democratic Party in that particular state in order to overturn this decision, in order to tax absolutely all Washingtonians with a progressive income tax rate that, again, will eventually include everyone, much like the federal system, which was promised as just a small tax on a small percentage, 2% on the top 2%. We now pay two different income taxes in the payroll tax and the federal income tax. This is what they're going for in Washington state. But by the way, there were other hints in the history of Washington state that I didn't know about previously, but in my research, I ended up discovering that actually 100% show that they've tried this before, specifically with the capital gains tax.
An historic ruling from the state Supreme Court this morning. A majority of the justices ruled the state can collect taxes on capital gains.
So that was a local news segment from March of 2023 where they were talking about how the Washington State Supreme Court actually ruled that the capital gains tax that was passed was not actually an income tax and therefore not unconstitutional. It was in fact an excise tax, and therefore it was appropriate in the state of Washington. And by the way, it is also notable that this was done in order to tax the rich to solve their fiscal problems, yet only a few years later, they're having the same exact fiscal problems because guess what? The revenue is not the issue. It is the spending. And we talked about this before, how Washington state has doubled in population in the last 10 to 20 years. And of course, during that period of time, spending has tripled. So obviously the issue at hand is that spending is far outpacing the actual population of the state of Washington and inflation as well. When you factor both of those in, spending is still significantly higher. But again, we heard the same promises back in 2023 about how this was going to fund childcare and all sorts of other things.
Governor Jay Inslee signed it into law back in 2021. It taxes the state's top investment earners on their stocks and bonds profits. Now, critics sued, saying those profits are income, and an income tax is unconstitutional in the state. But Democrats argued it was an excise tax and a more fair way to generate funds for childcare and schools.
And again, I will point out that Washington State, much like Minnesota, does have a problem with Somali daycare fraud. So all you're doing by approving of these taxes is ensuring that more of your money goes out the back door. But very interestingly, this was a capital gains tax on millionaires. People with income over $1 million, if they sold stocks, were going to have to pay this quote-unquote excise tax of 9.9%. Again, stop me if you heard this one before, on those capital gains, and it was specifically long-term capital gains that they were going after. And remember, it was an issue of justice.
There has been an invisible injustice for over a century now in the state of Washington, where working people were bearing an unfair burden.
Now, of course, Republicans warned at the time that the reason they set up the capital gains tax in the way that they did was to eventually challenge the ruling that said an income tax is unconstitutional because it would be a differential property tax, which you can't have in the state of Washington. And even though those warnings were given out back in 2023, here we are just a few years later, 3 to be exact, and we're in the same exact scenario.
Well, I'm a little surprised, right? Because every other state in the union and the IRS still calls it an income tax. I guess the one saving grace here is that they did call it an excise tax and they didn't change the longstanding ruling that income is property. So I know their goal is to get a full-blown income tax, and this ruling today shouldn't give them the ability to do that.
But Senator Wilson said Washingtonians, taxpayers should be on guard because she feels like that threshold for the capital gains tax will eventually be lowered and more people will have to pay that.
Now, we'll put a pin in that warning for a little bit later, but I also want to remind you of what I said the strategy would be if they were able to get this quote-unquote millionaire's tax, which is actually an income tax, and how over time they would lower the threshold over and over again until they capture all income earners in the state of Washington, or at least the majority of income earners. And again, the promises of more government services and, of course, more tax breaks for Washingtonians that are at the bottom end of the spectrum, we're not going to supersede the damage that you're going to have by implementing this income tax. So let me give you a little bit of a prediction about what is going to happen. You're going to have all these people that are going to say, oh, well, we're going to actually not have to worry about anybody relocating. It's going to be no big deal. But then when they do leave, when revenue projections don't meet the excessive spending of that particular state, they will use that as a justification to lower the threshold from income over $1 million to income over $500,000, then income over $100,000, and so on and so forth until you have a state income tax that absolutely everyone pays. Now, guess what? And by the way, I didn't know this when I did that original video and I was speculating on what the strategy was around the future income tax. Well, that prediction turned out to be 100% sage, accurate in every possible way, because just 2 years after they got that court ruling that said the capital gains tax was an excise tax, instead of being a percentage on the capital gains made by millionaires, again, anybody with a combined income plus capital gains over $1 million would pay the 9.9%. They decided to create a tiered system, and guess where they start the new tier for long-term capital gains tax in the state of Washington? They start it at $1. At $1, you have to pay 7% of your profits to the state of Washington in taxes. And this is something that they implemented just 2 years after they got that Supreme Court ruling. And by the way, if you're over $1 million, it's 9.9%, but it's 7% from $1 all the way to $1 million. And by the way, even though they implemented this on June 30th of 2025, they made it retroactive to the beginning of the year, meaning if you already had sold your stocks prior to this, guess what? You're going to get hit with that tax, or you did get hit with that tax for the 2025 year. So this is something that they absolutely 100% already did. This is why I warn you about any type of new taxation, because immediately once it gets approved, once it gets past constitutional muster, once it gets through the courts, they end up applying it to everyone. And again, it took them less than 3 years in order to do so. So make no mistake about it, if they get this income tax approved at the court level, like they crafted the law specifically to challenge that previous court decision, every Washingtonian will be paying it. And again, they didn't even lower it to like $270,000 worth of income or maybe even $100,000. They immediately lowered it to $1 worth of income they were going to start taxing. And even with that massive tax increase on absolutely everyone, they still had fiscal problems that were absolutely dire just 1 year later. And that was the excuse to implement the millionaire's tax. When are you guys going to get it that when they raise taxes, when they create new types of taxes, that doesn't balance the budget because spending goes up proportionally? Again, New York City is one of the few cities in the entire nation with an income tax. By the way, it also kicks in incredibly low. You're paying about 3% of your income on income from $0 to $12,000, and you're paying closer to 4% at the top rate of the New York City income tax. But in addition to that, New York City on its own is spending more than the budgets of 47 states in the union, including Florida, which has a significantly larger population, 3 times the population of the city of New York. And by the way, we also have a state income tax that's also absurd and ridiculous. And even though New York State has a lower population than the state of Florida by about 2 to 3 million, they're spending over double Florida's state budget. When you increase the tax pool, when you increase the options for revenue for these people, they raise spending. And then again, they constantly push for more and more because you're not addressing the true core of the issue, which is the spending side of the equation, not the taxation side. And these documents absolutely 100% make that crystal clear.
And what is so remarkable about these records is that they were very, very explicit and very, very precise about what the purpose of the bill is. And so in normal world, you introduce a bill like a tax, and it's intended to tax certain types of activities, and it's intended to raise revenue for certain types of programs. That's the purpose, on the surface, on paper. But in these emails, he made it clear that the purpose of him introducing this bill is not to impose a tax on millionaires, and it's not intended to fund these programs. It's intended to overturn a century's worth of legal precedent in which income is considered property under our state constitution. And what that means is you cannot have a progressive income tax in our state. So they're trying to get this precedent overturned, in which every single Supreme Court that has ever existed in Washington state history since this ruling has said income is property. They even said at one point in a ruling, we're done having this conversation. If you want a progressive income tax, go to the voters. And so this is the purpose of this bill. This has completely destroyed any advocacy for this millionaire's tax that is only going to apply to the wealthy, and it's making the wealthy pay their fair share, whatever that means.
Now look, I've never heard of this outlet called the Center Square, but I'm going to link them in the description, and I'm really going to encourage you guys to check out the videos that they've done about this, subscribe to their channel, because they put in all the work for this. They went through all of these documents, they presented it to the public, and without them, we would not be able to report on this scheme, on this plan, in order to scam Washingtonians out of their hard-earned income. Again, we would be down to speculation, accurate speculation, based on their pattern of behavior, but we wouldn't have them caught dead to rights doing exactly what they're doing. So it's important to support local outlets or even independent local outlets that are putting in the work in order to get this information to the public, because again, without them, we would not have these documents. We would not have this information. We would not know that specifically what they're trying to do is not go in the constitutional direction where they would have to amend the Constitution, but instead get the court, the current court, to change their ruling to make this a possibility for everyday Washingtonians. And by the way, we did a previous video about how all these different businesses are leaving Washington state. They're going to places like Nashville, Tennessee, like Texas. And one of the advantages that Washington state had in comparison to other blue states that have blue cities in them is that they were also a zero income tax state. And once you lose that status, it is gone forever. You are going to never get that back because these people will never let go of that revenue. revenue. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the absolute exposure of the Washington State Democrats. Till next time.